Zelda Fitzgerald was 47 years old when the hospital that had locked her away for nearly 2 decades caught fire around her. On the night of March 10, 1948, she lay sedated on the 5th floor of a locked psychiatric ward in Asheville, North Carolina, while smoke climbed through the building's dumbwaiter shaft toward the room where she slept. The windows on her floor were fitted with chains. Not to imprison her, hospital policy insisted, but to stop patients from jumping. That same policy helped seal her inside. By morning, 9 women were dead. Zelda was one of them. The wife of novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald, a woman newspapers and biographers had spent nearly 30 years calling crazy, unstable, the wife who wrecked a literary genius. That label outlived her. For most people today, it is still the only thing they know about her. The documented record does not entirely agree with it. Before the diagnosis, before 18 years moving between psychiatric hospitals, before her own husband began directing how her story, and eventually her unfinished novel, would be told, Zelda Sayre was something the label never accounted for. A serious dance student training 8 hours a day in Paris, a published writer with her own byline, a woman who kept reaching, decade after decade, for a life that belonged to her and not to her husband's fame, who locked her away, why, and what it ultimately cost her is documented in letters, hospital files, and court testimony that most retellings of her story skip entirely. We're going through them now. Zelda Sayre was born in Montgomery, Alabama, in July 1900, the youngest of 6 children belonging to Anthony Dickinson Sayre, a justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, and Minnie Mackin Sayre, a former singer who had once dreamed of a stage career before marriage redirected her. The household ran on the judge's discipline. He kept fixed hours, expected obedience, and according to several biographers rarely needed to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough. His youngest daughter became known across Montgomery for doing precisely the opposite of what was expected of her. By her teenage years, Zelda had a local reputation that outpaced her age. She smoked when girls weren't supposed to smoke. She swam in a flesh-colored bathing suit that, from a distance, looked like nothing at all, and let the rumor travel faster than the truth. She was voted prettiest and most attractive in her senior class superlatives, and she kept a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about herself, a habit biographers point to as evidence of a girl who understood, early, that she was being watched and intended to have some say in what people saw. One frequently retold anecdote, sourced to people who knew the family, captures exactly the kind of reputation she had built by then. As a girl, she is said to have once called the local fire department to report a child stranded on a rooftop, then climbed onto her own roof to watch the truck arrive for an emergency she had invented herself. Whether the story happened exactly as told or grew slightly with each retelling, it had already calcified into local legend by the time she was a teenager, which says as much about how Montgomery understood her as anything she actually did. The contrast between the judge's exacting public discipline and his daughter's defiant private one became, for neighbors and later biographers alike, an irresistible shorthand for explaining her. In July 1918, with the country still at war in Europe, she met a young Army lieutenant stationed nearby at Camp Sheridan. Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald, 21 years old, ambitious, broke, and already certain he was destined to be a famous writer. He had not yet published a novel. What he had was a manuscript he believed in, called The Romantic Egotist, and a habit of falling hardest for women who unsettled him. Zelda did both at once. Their courtship was long distance and conducted almost entirely on her terms. Scott left for New York to make his fortune in advertising and was, by his own later account, miserable at it. Zelda kept dancing with other officers and made clear in her letters that she had no intention of marrying poverty. When Scott proposed, she said yes, then broke the engagement when his prospects failed to improve fast enough. Surviving letters from this stretch, archived at Princeton, show a courtship run almost entirely on her schedule. Scott pleading for reassurance, Zelda withholding it, both of them fully aware that his literary career and their relationship now depended on the same outcome. Only after his first novel, This Side of Paradise, was accepted for publication in the fall of 1919 did she agree to set a date. They married at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York in April 1920, 1 week after the novel's release, in a small ceremony attended by almost none of Zelda's family. Scott was 23. Zelda was 19. The marriage that began in that small, half-empty ceremony would make her one of the most photographed women in America before she turned 21. It would also, within 2 decades, become the single explanation the public reached for whenever they needed to make sense of everything that happened to her afterward. This side of paradise made Scott Fitzgerald famous almost overnight, and it made the Fitzgeralds as a couple a kind of public spectacle. Newspapers wanted photographs. Magazines wanted profiles. Zelda, sharp-tongued, quotable, photogenic, became as much a part of the story as the book itself. The press began calling her the first American flapper, a label that stuck for the rest of her life and well beyond it. What gets left out of that label is how directly Zelda's own voice built her husband's early career, and how unevenly the credit landed. As early as 1919, Scott published a short story called Babes in the Woods in the Smart Set magazine, drawing so closely on entries from Zelda's actual diary and letters that biographers have since traced specific lines almost directly back to her own handwriting. It would not be the last time. When a 1922 review in the New York Tribune covered Scott's novel The Beautiful and Damned, the review pointed out with evident amusement that passages from the heroine's diary bore a striking resemblance to entries from Zelda's own diary. Zelda herself wrote that review under her own byline and used it to needle her husband publicly, noting in print that he seemed to have found her diary and a number of her old letters useful material. It remains one of the only moments in the marriage's public record where Zelda's authorship of her own life is acknowledged in writing by Zelda, while the world was still watching. Their daughter, Frances Scott Fitzgerald, known always as Scotty, was born in October 1921 in St. Paul, Minnesota. Zelda's recorded reaction coming out of anesthesia, later quoted in Scott's own notebooks, was a half-joking hope that the baby would grow up to be a beautiful fool, since that was the best thing a girl could be in this world. Scott liked the line enough to write a close version of it into The Great Gatsby 3 years later, putting nearly identical words into the mouth of Daisy Buchanan. It became one of the most quoted lines in 20th-century American fiction. For decades, almost no reader knew where it had actually come from. Zelda was not only supplying raw material for her husband's fiction during these years. She was publishing under her own name too. In June 1922, Metropolitan magazine ran an essay by Zelda titled Eulogy on the Flapper, a sharp, self-aware piece arguing that the flapper image splashed across every newspaper in the country had already curdled into a costume other women were now performing, emptied of whatever original defiance it once held. It is a detail that complicates the popular image of Zelda as simply Scott's invention or his muse. By 21, she was already a War King magazine writer with her own opinions about the culture that had made her famous, getting paid for them under her own name. The fame came with money, and the money came with a lifestyle that quickly outpaced even Scott's growing income. The couple moved constantly, Connecticut, New York City, Great Neck on Long Island, running up hotel bills, throwing parties that became legendary for their chaos, and spending in patterns biographers consistently describe as compulsive on both sides. Friends recalled a couple who treated their own youth like a performance with a paying audience. Riding on the roofs of taxicabs, jumping fully clothed into the fountain outside the Plaza Hotel, walking into parties they hadn't been invited to simply because the door happened to be open. Scott's drinking, which would come to define so much of the rest of his life, was already a fixture of these years, though in the early 1920s it was framed by Scott, by Zelda, and by the press as nothing more than the era's general appetite for excess. Fame built on someone else's unpublished diary, though, has a way of curdling once the diary's owner starts wanting credit of her own. Within a few years, it did. By 1924, the Fitzgeralds had relocated to the French Riviera, chasing cheaper living and better weather while Scott worked on what would become The Great Gatsby. There, they fell in with a circle of wealthy American expatriates centered on Gerald and Sarah Murphy, whose seaside villa became a gathering point for a generation of writers and artists living abroad. Within that same social world, Scott formed a close, complicated friendship with a younger, still largely unknown writer named Ernest Hemingway. A friendship that would shape, more than almost any single event, how the public eventually came to understand Zelda. Hemingway disliked Zelda from nearly the start, and said so repeatedly, in letters and later in his own published writing. He believed she was jealous of Scott's talent, that she encouraged his drinking specifically to sabotage his work, and in A Movable Feast, his memoir published after both Fitzgeralds were dead. He went further, portraying her as someone who had deliberately set out to wreck her husband's career out of resentment. In one frequently cited passage from that same memoir, Hemingway claimed Zelda had once made a remark to Scott so personal and undermining that it left him deeply insecure for years afterward, a claim that exists only in Hemingway's own retelling, decades later, of a private conversation, and one several biographers have since treated with open skepticism, given Hemingway's well-documented habit of reshaping his own legend. Zelda, for her part, thought Hemingway was a fraud built out of performed masculinity, and told Scott so directly and often. The mutual hostility was real and well documented from both men's correspondence. And it mattered. Hemingway outlived Zelda by 16 years, remained among the most famous writers alive for most of that time, and his version of her, vindictive, destructive, the woman who broke a genius, became, for much of the 20th century, close to the default version most readers ever encountered. That same summer, in the resort town of Saint Raphael, Zelda spent a great deal of time with a young French naval aviator named Edouard Jozin. Biographers disagree on exactly how far the relationship went. Zelda, in later writings, described it as a serious infatuation that nearly ended her marriage. Jozin, interviewed decades afterward, downplayed it as a flirtation that never became physical. What isn't disputed is that the episode badly shook Scott, who later referenced it obliquely in his fiction and, by some accounts, confined Zelda to their villa for a period afterward to keep her from seeing Jozin again. Not long after, Zelda reportedly swallowed a large dose of sleeping pills, an episode some biographers treat as a genuine suicide attempt and others describe, more cautiously, given the thin surviving documentation, as a dangerous gesture rather than a fully resolved act. Scott found her in time. The marriage did not end. But whatever had cracked that summer, Zelda did not retreat from it quietly. She went looking, instead, for the one thing nearly every biographer agrees she had never really been allowed. A talent built entirely from her own effort, on her own schedule, owing nothing to her husband's name. In 1927, at a party outside Paris, the Fitzgeralds met the dancer Lyubov Egorova, a celebrated former star of the ballets Russes who now ran a respected studio of her own. Zelda, who had taken childhood dance lessons in Montgomery but nothing serious since, asked to study with her. She was 27 years old, by any professional standard, years past the age most dancers begin a career, let alone start one. She did not seem to care. What followed has been described by more than one biographer as an obsession, though the word undersells the discipline behind it. Zelda trained with Egorova up to 8 hours a day, often arriving before the studio opened and staying long after it closed. She wrote to friends about blistered, bleeding feet, about muscles that ached constantly, about forcing a body that had never been built for it into a shape years of practice still couldn't guarantee. She lost a significant amount of weight. Friends who saw her during this period described her as gaunt, intensely focused, and increasingly difficult to draw into ordinary conversation, as though ballet had stopped being a pursuit and become the only thing holding some larger structure together. The household reorganized itself entirely around the schedule. Scott later complained, in letters to friends, that their apartment had effectively become an extension of the studio. A practice bar installed, mirrors mounted on the walls, the smell of liniment and exertion replacing whatever domestic atmosphere had existed before. Scotty St. a young child, was handed off to governesses for most of these years, a pattern that had begun earlier in the marriage but intensified sharply as Zelda's hours at the studio lengthened. It is one of the more uncomfortable threads in this part of her life. The same drive biographers now read as a genuine, long overdue claim to an identity of her own also meant a small daughter raised largely by strangers during the years her mother was fighting hardest to become someone besides Mrs. Fitzgerald. Scott's jealousy over the training went further than complaints about furniture. In letters and later medical consultations, he suggested Zelda's devotion to Egorova had crossed from admiration into something closer to romantic obsession, an accusation Zelda denied, and one no biographer has ever been able to substantiate beyond Scott's own claims. Whatever the truth of it, the accusation itself reveals something about the marriage at this point. A husband increasingly willing to pathologize anything his wife wanted that existed outside of him. By 1929, Zelda's progress was real enough that she received an invitation to audition for the San Carlo Opera Ballet Company in Naples, Italy, a genuine professional opportunity, not a courtesy extended to a famous novelist's wife. She turned it down. Biographers attribute the decision to a mix of factors: her own doubts about her age and readiness, and pressure from Scott, who reportedly found the prospect of his wife pursuing an independent career, one that might take her away from him or simply away from the role of Mrs. Fitzgerald, deeply threatening. Scott would later write to Zelda's doctors that he believed the ballet training had directly caused her breakdown. Zelda's own writings from later years suggest she experienced it differently. Not as the thing that broke her, but as the one pursuit in years that had felt entirely hers, taken from her before she'd finished discovering what it might have become. This is a detail that surfaces in some form in nearly every serious account of Zelda Fitzgerald's life, and yet it rarely gets the weight it deserves. At 27, with a marriage already fraying and a public identity built entirely around someone else's fame, she tried late painfully against real odds to build something of her own. The medical language soon applied to her would describe that same attempt as a symptom. Within a year of turning down Naples, Zelda was no longer dancing at all. She was in a clinic outside Paris, and the question of what was actually wrong with her would occupy doctors, her husband, and eventually the public record for the rest of her life. In April 1930, while still living in Paris, Zelda suffered what her doctors described at the time as a complete nervous collapse. Hallucinations, severe anxiety, and a kind of constant inner agitation witnesses said she could neither explain nor control. She was admitted first to Malmaison Clinic outside Paris, then, after a brief and unsuccessful attempt to return home, to a more specialized facility, Les Rives de Prangens, a private sanatorium on the shore of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. It was at Prangens that Zelda was first formally diagnosed by Dr. Oscar Farrell, one of the clinic's leading psychiatrists, with schizophrenia. The diagnosis would follow her for the rest of her life, repeated in hospital after hospital, cited by doctors and by Scott himself as the explanation for nearly everything that happened to her afterward. It is worth noting, as several modern clinicians and biographers have, that schizophrenia in 1930 was a far less precise category than it is today, and that psychiatrists who have since reviewed her case, including some who treated her directly in later years, believed she more likely suffered from bipolar disorder, a condition with a markedly different course and, for the period, a markedly different prognosis. No one can revise the historical record with certainty now, but the diagnosis she carried for 18 years was, by the standards of the medicine that produced it, an educated guess wearing the authority of a verdict. Prangens was also extraordinarily expensive, and the cost became its own pressure inside the marriage. Scott, whose income depended entirely on his ability to keep writing and selling stories, was now financing one of Europe's most costly private sanatoriums while also covering Scotty's schooling and the couple's existing debts. Farrell, as part of his treatment approach, drew both Scott and members of Zelda's family directly into the therapeutic process. A relatively progressive method for the era, but one that also meant Zelda's illness became, almost from the moment of diagnosis, a managed family affair rather than a private matter between patient and doctor. Decisions about her care were frequently made in correspondence between Farrell and Scott, with Zelda absent from the conversation, even when the subject under discussion was her own treatment. What followed the diagnosis was treatment extensive and at times severe even by the standards of the era. Insulin coma therapy, a treatment that induced repeated comas through deliberate insulin overdose, carrying real risks of permanent injury or death, and used widely on schizophrenia patients throughout the 1930s. Heavy sedation, long stretches of confinement and clinical observation. Letters from this period, both Zelda's and Scott's, describe a woman cycling between apparent calm and acute distress while doctors adjusted dosages, and Scott, drinking heavily through his own anxiety, wrote checks for treatments he could barely afford and corresponded at length with her physicians about what, exactly, was wrong with his wife. Confined, sedated, and increasingly defined by other people's diagnoses of her, Zelda did the one thing almost no one expected. She picked up a pen, and in 6 weeks, beat her husband to the manuscript he had spent years circling. In 1932, while a patient at the Phipps Psychiatric Clinic at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Zelda wrote an entire novel in roughly 6 weeks. She titled it Save Me the Waltz. It told the story of a Southern judge's daughter who marries a painter, struggles to build an artistic identity of her own, first through dance, and gradually loses her grip on the life she had hoped to build. It was unmistakably her own story, told from the inside, in a prose style entirely her own. Dense, imagistic, sometimes startling. She sent the manuscript directly to Scott's editor at Scribner's, Maxwell Perkins, without showing it to Scott first. When Scott read it, he was reportedly furious. Not primarily over its quality, but because he was, at that exact moment, deep into his own novel, Tender as the Night, which drew on much of the same autobiographical material. Their marriage, her breakdown, the psychiatric hospitals, even some of the same imagery and incidents. He had been circling that material across multiple drafts for years. Zelda had finished her version of it in 6 weeks. What happened next is documented through surviving correspondence and editorial records. Scott insisted Zelda revise the manuscript before publication, stripping out material he felt overlapped too closely with his own work in progress. The male lead, drawn closely enough from Scott that the resemblance was unmistakable, was reworked and renamed, and sections dealing directly with the marriage's psychiatric hospitals were softened or cut. Maxwell Perkins, caught between two authors he represented and admired, tried to mediate, advocating in his own letters for preserving more of Zelda's original voice than Scott wanted to allow. Letters from this period show Scott directing changes to her book with the same authority he might have exercised over his own drafts, while her psychiatrists, weighing in on her treatment, debated whether resisting his demands would help or harm her recovery. Zelda made the changes. Save Me the Waltz was published in October 1932, dedicated with a complicated grace to Perkins. It sold poorly, drew mixed and often dismissive reviews, and went out of print within months. Tender is the Night, covering much of the same ground, followed 2 years later in 1934 to a far larger readership and far more critical attention, though it too underperformed compared to Scott's earlier work and left him convinced, for the rest of his life, that it had failed. 2 books, drawn from the same marriage, the same hospital corridors, the same collapse, written by 2 people who could not agree, even in fiction, on whose story it actually was. If you're new to this channel, this is the Tragic Muse, where we look past the headlines and the legends to the documented lives underneath them. If stories like this one matter to you, consider subscribing. There's more where this came from. In the spring of 1934, during a brief period of stability between hospitalizations, Zelda had her first and only solo exhibition of paintings, held at a small gallery in New York. The show, portraits, dreamlike figure studies, renderings of cities and dancers, drew curious crowds, partly for the work itself and partly because both the gallery and the press understood the appeal of exhibiting Scott Fitzgerald's institutionalized wife. Reviews were mixed and often condescending, more interested in her biography than her brushwork, and the show closed having sold almost nothing. Decades later, critics revisiting the surviving canvases would treat them with far more generosity than they received in 1934, by which point Zelda had been dead for years and could take no benefit from the reappraisal. For the rest of the 1930s, Zelda moved between hospitals and brief stretches at home. Craig House in New York, Shepard Pratt outside Baltimore, and finally, beginning in 1936, Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, a facility known for a relatively progressive approach. For its era, combining medical treatment with exercise, diet, and structured occupational therapy under its founder, Dr. Robert Carroll. Carroll's regimen was strict and physically demanding. Patients rose early, worked daily on the hospital's own farm, followed closely monitored diets, and exercised on a fixed schedule, alongside more conventional treatments including insulin therapy and, in later years, electroshock therapy, methods former staff and outside observers would later describe as harsh even measured against the standards of mid-century psychiatric care. Scott moved nearby periodically to stay close to her, though by now his own health and finances were in steep decline. He was drinking heavily, struggling to sell magazine stories at the rates that had once supported the family, and increasingly working in Hollywood as a screenwriter simply to cover the mounting hospital bills. Their daughter Scotty, meanwhile, grew up largely apart from both parents, raised through boarding schools, the homes of family friends, and, after 1934, mostly by proxy, with Scott managing her education and expenses from a distance and Zelda present mainly through letters. Scotty would later describe, in interviews given long after both of her parents had died, a childhood defined less by any single dramatic event than by a permanent low-grade unease, the experience of being loved by 2 people who were, for reasons she only fully understood as an adult, never quite available to provide the steady, ordinary parenting most of her classmates simply took for granted. Zelda's letters from this period, dozens of which survive, show a mother straining to stay involved anyway, offering opinions on clothes, schoolwork, boys, French verbs, all of it written from behind hospital walls she could not leave without medical permission. While Zelda's days narrowed to a hospital schedule of exercise, supervised meals, and clinical observation, Scott's life was narrowing 3,000 and miles away toward an ending of its own. By 1937, Scott had moved to Hollywood full-time, working as a contract screenwriter for MGM and, later, freelance, trying to rebuild a career that had stalled after Tender is the Night. The work paid the bills but rarely satisfied him, adapting other people's material, frequently uncredited, for a fraction of what he had once earned writing his own fiction. In 1940, struggling to place serious work anywhere, he began publishing a series of comic short stories about a washed-up screenwriter named Pat Hobby in Esquire. Wry, self-aware pieces that more than one biographer has read as Scott quietly writing his own professional decline into fiction, the same instinct that had once turned Zelda's diary into material now turned inward on himself. He began a relationship with the gossip columnist Sheila Graham during these years, one that lasted, with interruptions, until his death. Zelda knew about it, in general terms, through correspondence, though the two of them never formally divorced or fully separated. Visits, letters, and a kind of suspended long-distance marriage continued alongside it. Scott made real efforts at sobriety during the stretch, with mixed and often temporary success, and continued sending Zelda detailed letters about her treatment, her diet, her painting, her moods, the habits of 2 decades managing her care not easing even as his own health deteriorated. On December 21, 1940, Scott Fitzgerald died of a heart attack in Sheila Graham's Hollywood apartment. He was 44 years old, and had been working at the time on an unfinished novel, The Last Tycoon. Zelda, still a patient at Highland Hospital in Asheville, was not present and learned of his death by telephone. She attended his funeral in Maryland, then returned, within weeks, to the hospital routine that had structured most of the last decade of her life. The records from this period suggest a complicated grief, not simply sorrow, but a particular kind of disorientation that came from losing the one person who had, for 20 years, defined both her fame and her containment. Scott had been, by turns, her champion, her editor, her jailer, and her closest reader. With him gone, the question of who she was, what had happened to her, and whose fault it had been no longer had a single author either. Zelda did not collapse under the news. What she did instead, across the 7 years that followed, says as much about who she actually was as anything ever written in a hospital file. Zelda spent much of the 1940s in a pattern of admission, partial recovery, and discharge, periods living with her mother in Montgomery, interspersed with returns to Highland Hospital whenever her condition worsened. During the calmer stretches, she painted, often religious and folkloric imagery rendered in a vivid, untrained style that critics decades later would reassess far more generously than her contemporaries had. Religion became an increasingly central preoccupation. She attended church regularly while home in Montgomery, read scripture closely, and wrote letters that wove biblical language through ordinary observations about the weather, her health, and her daughter's progress at school. She also kept writing, working on a second novel, tentatively titled Caesar's Things, drawing once again on her own life and her deepening religious focus, that she never finished. She corresponded steadily with Scotty, who by the mid-1940s was attending Vassar College, marrying, and building a life increasingly separate from both of her parents' difficult history. Family members who saw Zelda during these years described her as gentle, often lucid for long stretches, devoted to her mother and sisters, and capable of a warmth and humor that sat uneasily beside the clinical language still attached to her name in hospital files. By early 1948, Zelda was back at Highland Hospital for what doctors believed would be a final, short stay. The start of March, her physicians told her she was well enough to be discharged. She chose, instead, to stay a few more weeks, by her own account, wanting to be certain the recovery would hold before she returned to ordinary life. On March 9th, she wrote to Scotty describing the early signs of spring over the mountains around Asheville. An ordinary letter about an ordinary week, with nothing in it to suggest it would be among her last. On the night of March 10, 1948, the night staff at Highland Hospital's central building changed shift at 10 o'clock. 2 nurses, Doris Anderson and Ruth Dunn, came on duty. Anderson, newly hired and working her first night supervising the building alone, handled the standard nightly rounds, which included administering sedatives to patients before bed. Zelda Fitzgerald was one of those patients, sedated and asleep on the 5th floor alongside 10 other women. Sometime around 11:30 p.m., a fire broke out in the building's kitchen on a lower floor, and smoke began traveling upward through the dumbwaiter shaft connecting all 5 floors. Anderson, the first staff member to notice it, worked quickly to lead patients on the lower floors to safety, then climbed toward the 5th floor. But smoke pouring through the shaft overwhelmed her before she could reach the women sleeping there, including Zelda. She was forced to retreat. By the time firefighters arrived roughly 25 minutes later, flames had already broken through the building's roof. The rescue effort that followed was hampered by a detail built directly into the hospital's own design. The upper floor windows were fitted with screens and chains, meant to keep patients from jumping or escaping during a crisis. That same safeguard, on the night of the fire, made it far harder for both patients and rescuers to get out. More than 1,000 residents of Asheville reportedly gathered near the hospital grounds as the blaze spread, watching while more than 40 firefighters worked through the night to bring it under control. 11 women were pulled out alive. 9 were not. Zelda Fitzgerald, 47 years old, was among the dead, reportedly identified afterward by a single charred ballet slipper recovered near her remains. Whether read as coincidence or quiet irony, it is a detail that has stayed with nearly everyone who has written about her death since. In the weeks that followed, a coroner's jury investigated the fire and concluded that negligence had occurred, though not to a degree the jury classified as criminal. A second, separate investigation opened in April after the hospital's night supervisor, Willie Mae Hall, not on duty in the central building at the time of the fire, but responsible that night for overseeing all the patient buildings, told police during questioning that she had thought about specific ways the building could be set alight, and asked, in her own words, to be locked up out of fear of what she might do. She was held briefly while authorities investigated the possibility of arson. No charges were ultimately filed, and exactly how the fire started in that kitchen was never conclusively resolved. It remains, in the official record, an open question. Zelda's body was returned to Maryland and buried beside Scott's, at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Rockville. The same town, the same plot, a marriage that had never formally ended now reuniting them, finally, in the ground. For most of the 20th century, Zelda Fitzgerald's story was told primarily through other people's accounts of her. Her husband's letters and fiction, her doctor's case files, magazine profiles that crowned her the original American flapper before she had turned 25, and a famous friend's memoir that recast her, after both of their deaths, as the woman who quietly ruined a genius. The label that outlasted her, crazy, unstable, the wife who destroyed a great man's talent, was assembled almost entirely by people with a stake in how the story was told, frequently while she herself was behind hospital walls and unable to answer back. The record that survives her tells a more layered story. Her letters, her one published novel, her paintings, the testimony of nurses, doctors, and her own daughter. A woman who, at nearly every stage of her adult life, kept reaching for an identity that belonged to her alone, inside a marriage and a medical system that consistently treated that reaching as the symptom rather than the substance. She never got the dance career she trained for at 27. She never finished her second novel. She spent close to a third of her adult life inside institutions, under a diagnosis that more recent psychiatric thinking has since called into serious question. And she died behind windows that had been chained shut specifically to keep her safe. It would be its own kind of distortion to remember her only as a victim. The record shows agency too. In the diary review she wrote, in print, naming exactly what her husband had taken from her. In the 6 weeks she spent writing the book he then tried to control. In the studio hours she logged at an age everyone around her insisted was already too late to matter. By the accounts of nearly everyone who actually knew her, she was formidably intelligent, frequently funny, and entirely capable of fighting for herself within the narrow space she'd been given. That space was the problem. She was never the one who needed fixing. What remains nearly 80 years later is the work she managed to finish: one novel, dozens of paintings, hundreds of letters, and a slowly shifting historical record finally asking a different question than the one the headlines asked in 1948. Not what was wrong with her, what, given the chance she was never fully allowed, she might have made.